Thanks for joining us today on Mormon Land, where we explore news in and about the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I'm managing editor Dave Noyce. I oversee the Salt Lake Tribune's faith coverage. I'm joined again by senior religion reporter Peggy Fletcher-Stack. Hi, Peggy.
Hi, Dave.
We remind our listeners about another way to support Mormon Land. Just go to patreon.com, where with a small donation, you can access transcripts to our podcasts and our complete newsletter. Again, that's Patreon, patreon.com/Mormonland. And if you haven't already, follow us on Instagram at mormon.land. Now for today's episode. When Brigham Young University teams play on the road, they, like any visiting opponent, expect to encounter their share of jeers from the home crowd. But what happens when the razzing turns raunchy and when the boos give way to bigotry? That occurs all too often at Cougar games. Obscene choruses, often emanating from opposing student sections, break out, mocking BYU's sponsoring religion, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and members of that faith. Why have Latter-day Saints and their beliefs become the target of such openly prejudiced chants? Do Catholics in Notre Dame run into the same hostility? And what, if anything, could or should BYU and Latter-day Saint leaders do in responding to such discrimination? Here to answer those questions and more are Salt Lake Tribune sports writer Kevin Reynolds, who covers the Cougars and wrote about this issue in a recent special report, and Britain Covey, a practicing Latter-day Saint who starred at BYU's rival school, the University of Utah, plays for the world champion Philadelphia Eagles, and has deep familial ties to BYU. Britain and Kevin, welcome.
Thanks, guys. Yeah, so happy to be here.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Dave.
Great. Hey, Kevin, let me start with you, okay? Tell us where this chant, which I'll edit here so listeners know what it is. It's F the Mormons, has happened. Where has it happened, and how did the host schools and BYU respond when it happened?
Yeah, so I think we're talking in this decade of BYU athletics, we're talking about three main instances of this chant occurring. The first, I would say, is 2021 when BYU football went on the road to play USC. Happened the next year when BYU football went on the road to play at Oregon. And then most recently, just a couple months ago, when BYU men's basketball went to play Providence in Rhode Island, it happened again. But talking to BYU athletic officials throughout this story, they said that while those are probably the three most highly publicized instances of this happening, these aren't really isolated incidents. I mean, quarterback Jake Retzlaff talked about how just when BYU football went on the road to SMU, it happened again, even though that wasn't as highly publicized. And scholars kind of, when we were talking about this story, noted that this decade is a little bit different from years past when BYU's had chants or protests against them, because these chants haven't been necessarily attached to a church policy or a church teaching like they were maybe in the 1960s or 70s when BYU athletics ran into this. These are more isolated to, or more generalized, I guess the chants would be.
Mm-hmm. It was interesting, too, because the Providence one, that's a Catholic school.
Yes.
And SMU is a religious school.
Yes.
Also, right?
Yeah.
So, now, in your research, and your story was fascinating, you can read it at sltrib.com. What did you learn about such anti-religious courses in history and in modern times? Where else does this kind of thing happen in the world?
Yeah, I think sometimes in Utah we're so focused on the LDS church, right, that we always focus on that. But at the same time, like talking to people who study this has been something that's going back all the way to the Romans and the Greeks. Like one of the more fun parts about this story, actually researching it, was there was Roman chariot racing where this happened, and this was like, I didn't know anything about this, but the chariot racing was very sophisticated in terms of fans would travel hundreds of miles, hours and hours to go see these races, and they had teams, blue, white, red teams, and the chariot racers themselves actually were massive, famous figures, and his name was Felix, I think, and when he had his funeral, fans were so upset that he died that they actually set themselves on fire. So like there was a massive amount of investment in these events, kind of similar to, I think, it's not apples to apples, but similar to college athletics today and the NFL today, and how much investment there is from fans. But even at those events, I think it went hand in hand where people would come in with these religious tablets that were depicting, maimed opposing fans and opposing teams. So like this isn't something that just happened now, and it's been happening for a long time. But on a more modern level, I think it happens in Glasgow when we look at some of the soccer scenes out there, where there's a school, or there's a club called Celtic FC, which is a Catholic club over there. And whenever they play a Protestant club, Rangers FC, there's often chants of everybody hates Roman Catholics and different choruses like that. And and even more modern, that was in 2019. You look at the World Cups in 2022 and 2018. I think the FIFA, the Soccer Federation, fined the Mexican Football Federation for chants that were anti-LGBTQ at opposing goalkeepers. And so they fined them, I think, $114,000 at the time. So this isn't isolated to just BYU, and it's not isolated to just this time period.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so Britain and Kevin, do you see these anti-religious chats against Catholics at Notre Dame or Georgetown or Boston College or Churches of Christ when Pepperdine plays, or even Jews? Have we heard any anti-Jewish chants at football games when Yeshiva plays?
I'll let you go ahead and answer that, Kevin. I haven't really been a part of many of those matches.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, I haven't covered those games either, but at the same time, just speaking to people who do study this, they say it's a lot less common, at least with Pepperdine and other schools, mostly because I think there's an element to there's not a lot of schools that play high major college athletics at that level that are religiously affiliated. I think a lot of the highest level religiously affiliated schools tend to be Catholic. You think of Notre Dame, Boston College, like a lot of Big East schools, kind of in the Northeast corridor. And one of the interesting parts, I think, where we were talking to scholars about was that with the Catholic schools, it actually tends to be intra-religious, where if these things kind of manifest, it's actually between Catholic schools themselves, just because there are a lot of them. Catholic schools maybe of the Augustinian order versus the Jesuit order. You look at, the Big East. I think that's a big thing. I think we were watching last night, or 2 nights ago, Villanova was playing St. John's, right? Like those are two Catholic schools. And I think it manifests just differently, whereas BYU is kind of alone. That's really only LDS affiliated Division I giant. So really, I think all anti-LDS sentiment goes to BYU rather than with Catholics, where it's just not really the same. It's not a one-to-one because there's a lot of universities at that level playing.
Okay, so Britain, why do you think BYU and Latter-day Saints seem to make such an easy target?
Yeah, it's a good question. And it's funny because, as you alluded to earlier, I have deep ties to BYU, right? And as Kevin said, I think that specific chant might be unique to this generation, but I remember when BYU played TCU on the road back in the early 2000s, and I remember being a little kid seeing signs that said that very phrase. And I remember when Jimmer played San Diego State and the whole student section was dressed up as missionaries, and there were some pretty obscene chants that came from that game. And so I remember I've seen this, throughout my whole life to some degree. And I think that it is kind of a cross that you bear as a member of the Church of Jesus Christ, right? It's even, I can't tell you how many conversations I have in the locker room about misconceptions about the church. This is a weekly occurrence where I'll just sit down for lunch with all my teammates and they'll just come up with some big, so tell me about this. And it's just something that's totally, misconstrued or not true. And I always enjoy kind of clarifying those things. Recently, obviously, it's been that big new docu-series, right, about Brigham Young. And I'm not a history expert, but I know enough to kind of clarify where a lot of those have kind of strayed off the path. And so I think that for me, I've never viewed it as too much of a negative thing. I understand that there is a line where you have to say something. And I think that the brethren in the church have done a good enough job of coming out and saying things, whether that's with, sports or with something like the Book of Mormon musical. But at the end of the day, I think that, coming down and saying, don't do this, you can't say this, we don't want people to say these things, that doesn't change anybody's heart, right? And at the end of the day, it's the response and the willingness to kind of bear those chants that I think changes people's hearts and makes them more interested at the end of the day. So I know that there is a line in which you want to say, Why do we allow this? This shouldn't be allowed. We should fine people for saying things like this. And I do think there is, but at the same time, that doesn't really change people, right? As much as the opposite response of being a peacemaker, like we're always taught.
So do you think, Britain, just a quick follow-up, do you think one of the reasons BYU and the church are easy targets is because of a lack of knowledge? Like it's not very well known, other than pretty stereotypical, exploitive TV shows.
Mm-hmm.
It sounds like your job is to sort of educate a little bit, not be defensive, but just say, that's actually not true,
right?
Or something. Do you think it's lack of knowledge?
Absolutely. And I think about sometimes my own lack of knowledge. For example, you mentioned the Catholic Church. You hear things, you see a movie about it, and you assume that's how it is at times. And so I think it's important to kind of check yourself on those things. But it definitely is a lack of knowledge. And I think with the rise of social media and these algorithms that you can get on, especially anti-religious algorithms, are very strong these days. And what happens is these influencers and algorithms, they show religions, specifically our religion, but I'm sure others, with the least amount of grace possible. So they'll present data and facts as if it's a black and white kind of thing without any context, in the worst light imaginable. And so, of course, if that's the only thing that you see, you're going to have these misconceptions. And so, yes, like I said, I can't tell you how many times I clarify these with my teammates. And so I'm sure everybody does with their other coworkers, but it definitely is a lack of knowledge.
So, Kevin, scholars told you in the story that there is a, quote, perfect storm right now that's giving root to some of these chants. And we've mentioned one, that the latest show that's on American Primeval, which historians have already said it strays greatly from what really happened. So what is the perfect storm? Explain what they told you, why they think it's happening now.
Yeah, no, I mean, a big part of it was what Britain was just talking about with there's so many shows right now, which is kind of unique in this time period. I know it happened in 2010 too with the Book of Mormon and Mitt Romney running for president in 2012 as well. But American Primeval, Under the Banner of Heaven, there's been so many blockbuster TV shows about the church that have put, I think, the church in a lot of people's minds. But at the same time, it is a religious minority in America. I mean, there's only 7 million people practicing in the United States. So Patrick Mason talked about this, the professor at Utah State, and that it creates this almost disproportionate effect where a lot of people have heard about the church or it's in their minds, but they actually don't know a single actual member of the church, where I think it kind of can create some of these misconceptions, where Britain's talking about where there's nobody to go to for a lot of people who might look at that show and not be able to check whether that's true or not with a person just in their day-to-day lives, which I think can lead to some of these chants where, there's not a lot of checks and balances there in everyday life, but also, and there's other things that we talked about too, where BYU is alone in terms of being a major college athletics giant at that level. That is really the only LDS affiliated school. And then the third part about that too is I think that a lot of scholars talked about is what's maybe different from BYU, from a Notre Dame, or from even a Providence where we saw this chant happen, is that faith is a massive part of an average student's life at BYU, where it might not be the same or it's not the equivalent at Providence, just because obviously we know the honor code at BYU, but also over 80% of its students serve religious missions, which isn't the case necessarily at a lot of Catholic universities at the highest level of college athletics. And it's also located right at the heart of where the faith's power center is, where it's not like Notre Dame is playing at the Vatican, right? And so I think where scholars talked about was that it attaches the average fan at Providence sees BYU much more religiously than maybe they would even equate a Boston College to Catholicism, right? Because of that inherent connection BYU has with its faith and its students have with its faith. So it kind of creates this perfect storm, I think. And like Patrick Mason said, this isn't necessarily unique. He saw it happen in the 2010s in the 2012s when the Book of Mormon came out and the musical. And also when Mitt Romney was running for president, he said a lot of the same elements and factors happened then, but he said it's just coming up again since 2022, kind of American or under the banner of heaven till now. He thinks it's kind of this moment where there's all the elements happening again. And you've seen it with really, you can mirror the timelines of Oregon to Providence 2022 almost exactly.
Mormon Land will be right back.
So Britain, back to you. So you played at the U, which also has a lot of LDS students, but also some hostility. What kind of religious bigotry, if any, did you encounter in Utah? And what about the NFL?
Yeah, well, I mean, not the whole reason, but a good portion of the reason why I did choose to go to Utah was to kind of break down some of those misconceptions, right? That homegrown Utah County kid doesn't need to live his religion just in the place that it's sponsored by, right? And so I was excited about the prospect of going up to Utah, kind of like Morgan Scally did, and many others before me, and just being a regular everyday member of the church and serving a mission. I'd say the most hostility I faced was because I played a year before my mission, and I had a successful season, and then I chose to go on a mission, which at the time people were starting to kind of go right out of high school, and if you played a year, a lot of times you wouldn't stay you wouldn't go on the mission. You'd kind of just stay. So I chose to go on a mission, and I experienced some hostility at that moment. But I'm not going to lie, even sometimes when I see another athlete choose to go on a mission, I'm like, dang, I got to wait another 2 years before I get to watch him play. So I get that part of things, right? But I experienced some hostility. However, it's funny is I like what you said, Kevin, about it comes down to people knowing other members, because my teammates protected me like none other. I will never forget going to house parties, and I would have offensive linemen just pick me up and take me out and say, Covey, this is not for you, and so people respect it. The more you know, and the more, I would say, personal your connection is to it. It's anyone from the outside without personal connections that I think are a lot more hostile. But yeah, I mean, this is what whenever I go speak to other youth members, this is what I say to them is just, the truer you are and the more unashamed you are of your membership and your beliefs, the more people respect it, actually. I think that people a lot of times feel this need to almost like, be a little bit ashamed of their faith and kind of toe the line and, say, I'm a member of the church, but I've always found that the more unashamed you are and the more proud you are of it, people respect that so much, and they end up defending you for it, right? And it's the same thing with even like garments in the locker room. I get all the time people, that will ask me about my garments in the locker room, and I take it as an opportunity not to be like, oh yeah, it's just a weird religious thing. I think sometimes do that with coffee too, or something like that. And I take an opportunity to tell why I do it and how important it is to me. And then pretty soon that teammate will be defending me if someone else brings up the garments. It'd be like, hey, those are his sacred religious things. Don't talk about, so that's kind of been my experience. I actually have faced a lot of, hostility sometimes from the outside, nothing but respect from others.
And in the NFL as well?
In the NFL as well. Oh, so much respect from my teammates. The Philadelphia Eagles, especially this year, we actually were a very religious group. I have multiple group text messages with a lot of my teammates where we'll send each other scriptures in the mornings. We will, say a prayer and scriptures before every game. And a lot of times they have me do it. So I'll obviously choose some scripture from the Old or New Testament, and very religious group. I think in football in general is a pretty religious sport. A lot of Christians in football.
So, Britain, I want to focus on when Utah and BYU would play each other in a game that's sometimes been dubbed the Holy War or the Unholy War, depending on how you want to look at it, I guess. And there's no doubt that anti-Mormon rhetoric amps up before
Absolutely.
that game and possibly at that game. What did you notice during that as a player and from fans?
Yeah. I mean, I did have a couple of instances during a BYU Utah game where I remember people saying things towards BYU and Mormonism, and then me like wanting to look at that Utah fan and be like, what about me? Like, I know you like me, and so I think taking that with a grain of salt. But this is the interesting part of this whole discussion, and I'm excited to read your article, Kevin. It's just, at what point is there a line drawn where you do say something about this, being either disproportionate towards us or just like wrong, and does that help? I think these are all important discussions that we have, and I'm sure the brethren have it all the time. Does it even help? But you can't just stand by and let all these misconceptions float about, or let 8-year-old fans in the crowd be exposed to things like this. But at the same time, I really do believe in free speech, and I guess some could call that hate speech, but sometimes I think that actually has an inverse effect where people learn what they don't want to be a part of by hearing that stuff.
So again, do you think the fact that many Utah students, U of U students, and players are Latter-day Saints, does that play a part in these sort of fan fights?
I mean, it is weird. I'll tell you, it's strange, because I don't condone that, and other fans are chanting that. And I think a lot of other people in there, and so it is strange. And I definitely think it has more to do with just the church, BYU being the major D1 powerhouse church sponsored school, more than it does, there being a good portion of Utah that also has it. I think it's just people associate BYU with the church, and a lot of people associate church with who knows what. And, it's also just sports in general. I wish sometimes I'm tempted to release like screenshots of my DMs, of my direct messages after football games, just to show that sports has turned people into absolute crazy people. Like, if I have a bad game, obviously if I have a good game, I have messages from the opposing team, right, telling me they hate me. But even if I have a bad game, I have hundreds of messages from my own fans telling me how terrible I am. They never want to see me on the field. If they ever see me in public, I should watch out. Like, I'm the worst they've ever seen. But it's constant, it's consistent. It's not just me, it's all my teammates. And it's this feeling of invincibility that people have when you're not talking face to face. And I think that people feel that online, and people feel that in a crowd because you don't feel the consequence of what you're chanting or typing.
Let's turn now to one thing we've been talking about, and that's, okay, how do or should response happen when these things happen? Kevin, when these chants occur, BYU, as your story reports, typically a school apologizes, BYU accepts the apology and essentially moves on. Some fans and even some experts you talk to or observers suggest a more aggressive approach might be better. What do they say would be better approach? Maybe.
Yeah. Well, when Britain's talking about how the 8-year-olds, right, are exposed to this chant, we actually talked to a father, Mark Buchanan, who took his daughter, a 10-year-old daughter, to the Providence game, and for a long time, I think he told me he had this belief that he was like, apology is fine and move on. Mm-hmm. But when his daughter was asking him on the drive back home from the game, what happened and why does
she
this
heard
happen?
that, obviously.
And this was her first, I think, college sporting event or at least BYU game. And I think if it kind of hit home for him of like, I don't really know what to tell my daughter anymore, right? And because of that, I think he wants, or at least he thought about, maybe there is room to push back a little bit more from BYU side, because I think being a father kind of hit home for him that I don't know how I'm going to explain this to my children and how to bring them to games at times. And so I think there's certainly some people who would like to see BYU or the church push back a little bit more on this and be more forceful than just accepting apology. But it also is challenging on how does that actually look and operate, in the real world. Like, you could remove fans almost immediately, but what happens if it is 1,000 fans chanting this, or an entire student section where sometimes this, these are massive venues that BYU and, obviously NFL stadiums, they play in massive venues. So logistically, it can be difficult. I mean, we've talked to experts who said, I don't know if that's the realistic path forward, is to remove people or remove whole sections immediately. But the second part of that, as we've saw with FIFA, right? Could there be fines instituted to schools against institutions where this happens? But one of the options would be to work with the Big 12 or a conference and say, this is the policy. And if it happens, almost like a field storming situation, right? We've seen that with the SEC, where if you storm the field, you get a fine. But also, is that a big deterrent? I don't know, because we've seen that also happen. And also the other part of that, with all these all these chants that have happened, or at least the major ones with Oregon, USC, and Providence, those were not inside the Big 12. Those weren't conference games. Those were non-conference games. So how would it apply, and how would it deter when BYU goes on the road, particularly with not just football, which doesn't play as many non-conference games, with basketball and a lot of these sports that play 50% of their schedule, 40% of their schedule, not within the Big 12. So I think there is some momentum, or at least some feeling within the fan base that maybe BYU should speak out, maybe the church should speak out more. But how does that actually look in practice, I think, is a little bit tougher to visualize, because there's not a solution. I don't think there's one solution where that just would say, oh yeah, I mean, it's never going to happen again, right? Like, I don't know what Britain, I don't know what you think, but you're in these arenas, right?
Yeah. Well, I think this is the whole part of all of this that makes it difficult, is there is not a perfect solution, and you don't want to fight fire with fire, but at the same time you want to protect. I definitely think the example of the kids is what would make people get off the couch and say, okay, this is enough. Like, I can handle this, but I'm not having my 10-year-old daughter exposed to this. It's the same reason why even in certain TV shows and stuff, they don't allow swear words. It's like on TV, it's just to protect kind of the younger generation. I don't know what the answer is. I don't think that the removal of fans would be effective, like you said. I think that fining schools is somewhat effective. I think more than anything, what I've always found to be the most effective form is taking your personal, because obviously when it's a personal conversation, you have so much more control over it, and people can see why it's offensive and why this. So how do you bring that feeling to the masses? And I think that if, the church continues to try and put out kind of heartfelt, sentimental examples of why this is offensive, and let that kind of circulate, I think that has a greater impact than punishable things. Does it solve it? Absolutely not. But I definitely think that it will reach a lot of people, and who knows, it might have some impact. I think this is, like I said, this is part of the cross that you have to bear. I really do think that. I think that's the cross that every person who's ever stood with Christ has had to bear since the beginning of time. And know that it's never going to go away, and that's okay. Like, I think you can teach your children about that. I was taught about that. But I this is where I would be curious to see. I don't know if the punishments are the most effective way, but I definitely think you got to stand up a little.
Britton, let me ask you, as a player, if it happens in real time and, say, the game officials are aware of it, what about penalizing the team in real time? What would you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, that's happened at times with other things. Mm-hmm. The hard part is then you get people disguised as certain fans. It's happened before. I mean, fans have been penalized for throwing water bottles on fields, storming the field too many times, right? Not just that, but streakers, right? Mm-hmm. And it's, I definitely think that it's a lot harder in football and a lot easier in certain other sports. It is interesting that there is a a great deal of protection from, I think that if it comes from like the NCAA, it's a lot better than if it comes from BYU, because, for example, there's a great deal of protection surrounding the LGBTQ community with this. For example, there was a golfer year ago or something who was caught on, well, he was mic'd up saying a slang term that was offensive to the LGBTQ community, and the PGA Tour stepped in immediately. I think they fined him. I think he lost one of his sponsorships. And, you know, I think that, you know, whether that's, I definitely think that that is more effective coming from the actual tour, coming from the actual organization, than it is coming from BYU, for example, if something like that is ever put into place. But does that harbor just more anger towards them? I don't know. There's no perfect answer here.
Kevin, let me ask you another thing. When you talked with some scholars about, okay, if the church or BYU responds more forcefully, that could open them up to more scrutiny about its own policies. You brought up the honor code, you know, which you know, many LGBTQ advocates have problems with it, of course, and other past policies that the church has had. That it could open that up to closer examination, which, you know, the church or BYU may not want. Mm-hmm. Isn't that what they talked about?
Yeah, no. Matt Harris, who has been on this show and does a good job, wrote a book about the protests against the church in the 1960s and 1970s called Second Class Saints. Mentioned that if BYU did, or the church, either one, did speak out more forcefully, it does invite a lot more eyeballs into to BYU that maybe weren't even already there. And one of the things he talked about was he felt that if BYU did speak out, that there would be a very big focus on the church's LGBTQ policies and how the BYU treats its own students, which I know Peggy's written quite a bit about recently and talked a little bit about on this podcast. So he said that is a factor and an element to any response from BYU or any institution, and the church particularly as well.
Okay, so Britain, one last question. How has this kind of bad behavior affected players like you? And what would you like? What would you like to see other fans and host stadiums do to prevent and stop these? So not the church, but just how's this affecting you and your play and your relationships?
Yeah. Well, I don't think it affects your play, really. I think that if you are at least at a big time, you know, athletic event, you know, anything in college or above, I think you're so used to being yelled at, jeered at, that nothing really affects your play. And the truth is, and maybe this is very depressing view of things, but I've kind of given up hope at controlling fan bases. If you play for the Philadelphia Eagles, you kind of realize that if you try and control them, it is going to be even worse. You know, I'll never forget when last year here, Jalen Hurts, MVP candidate, and he gets booed off the field in the first quarter by his own fans, you know? So it's not like the attempt to control fan bases in sports is just going to backfire. I really do believe that. I think it opens conversation for discussion after the game, but during the game, I have given up a little bit, this attempt to control. I think, you know, this is a whole different conversation, but I think sports betting and things like that has magnified it times 100. You know, I could have a whole podcast about the change in fandom from social media in about 2012, 2015, sports all the way from before that until now. And it's a completely different atmosphere. So it doesn't affect you. I don't think it should affect you. But I think it should open the door for conversation. I think that's more what we should focus on, is how can we, you know, pregame, postgame, open those doors without, like you said, do we want this unnecessary scrutiny? Is it worth it? Most of the time, I think it's not.
Well, Britain Covey, thanks for joining us today, and congrats on the Super Bowl title.
Thank you. Yeah, gonna celebrate.
Yeah. Kevin Reynolds, thanks for your reporting.
Yeah, thanks, Dave.
And thanks to Peggy Fletcher-Stack.
Always a pleasure.
And to our producer, Chris Samuels. We remind our listeners that they can keep up on all the happenings in and about the church by subscribing to the Salt Lake Tribune's free Mormon Land newsletter. Just go to sltrib.com to sign up, and we'll talk again next time on Mormon Land.